Mr. President.
Senator for Virginia.
Mr. President, it's been 2.5 weeks since the President announced—
Senator will suspend. The Senate is in a quorum call.
Mr. President, I ask the proceedings of the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, it's been 2.5 weeks since the President announced he was abruptly withdrawing U.S. forces from Syria, betraying our Kurdish allies and derailing the international fight against ISIS in Syria. In the course of one tweet, this President blindsided our allies in the region. Yes, the Kurds, but the Israelis and others as well. He blindsided our diplomats and blindsided our military, from the top brass down to our forces serving on the ground. Frankly, the only one who seemed to know that this was coming was the Turkish President, Mr. Erdogan. As a result, brave men and women who fought alongside the United States are now at the risk of being slaughtered by Turkish forces. Already, Kurdish fighters and unarmed civilians have been killed by Turkish armed groups' militias. Already, hundreds of ISIS detainees have escaped from prison, and ISIS is being given the space and time to regroup. Simply put, we may be witnessing one of the most significant counterterrorism setbacks in recent history. With nowhere else to turn, the Kurds have aligned themselves with the Assad regime. That's good news for one of history's most brutal dictators, a man who gasses his own people. It's also good news for his allies in Iran. But perhaps no one has benefited more from this disaster than Vladimir Putin. Just this week, Russia and Turkey agreed to a new joint strategy in Syria, greenlighting Russian and Syrian forces to clear the border region of any of our remaining Kurdish allies, and unfortunately, expanding Russia's footprint in the Middle East. The truth is, the President's sudden withdrawal from Syria, without a plan, without serious consideration for our Kurdish allies, I believe is a disaster and may harm our foreign policy for decades to come. If this is how the United States treats its allies, how can anyone trust the United States on a going-forward basis? Frankly, I fear most of the damage may already been done. No tweet, no press conference, no personal assurances from Erdogan or anyone else can rebuild the years of trust and progress that have been destroyed. But the least we can do, and perhaps, unfortunately, the most we can do, is to make sure those Kurdish allies who served alongside U.S. forces as translators and other military support roles are not left to die in Syria. That's why I've introduced the Syrian Allies Protection Act. This legislation is similar to programs in the past which granted special immigration visas to Iraqi and Afghani nationals who served alongside U.S. forces. The truth is, these Kurdish allies and their families are now at risk because of their work with U.S. forces. They're threatened not only by the Turkish incursion, but also by the freed ISIS fighters and by the Assad regime forces. This legislation would provide permanent American residence to Syrian nationals who worked for the U.S. during the last 6 months, who've obtained a favorable recommendation from a general or a flag officer in the chain of command, and who have passed through a background check and screening. The legislation also directs the administration to evaluate eligible individuals, to help evacuate eligible individuals to safety. If their lives are at risk remaining in Syria, they can either be brought to the United States or to a third country while appropriate vetting takes place. This legislation will not reverse what we did to our Kurdish allies, but it will show those who work with our military forces. In many cases, we've heard translators and others who the American forces left without even saying goodbye to because they had to withdraw so quickly. It would at least remove part of this stain. So, Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent the Judiciary Committee be discharged of S. 2625 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
The Senator for Kentucky.
reserving the right to object. Ironically, the Syrian Kurds may be closer to having some degree of autonomy or homeland than they have been in decades. With the new arrangement or rearrangement of alliances, the Syrian Kurds now will have an alliance with someone who will remain in Syria. Whether you like them or not, the Assad government is there to stay. There was never going to be a U.S. presence for long enough or great enough to preserve or create a homeland for them. I think there is every possibility that in alliance with Assad, that there will be some Kurdish arrangement. It happened in Iraq. In Iraq, the oil proceeds are shared. The Kurdish have wanted more in Iraq. They haven't got as much as they wanted, but they have gotten some degree of autonomy within their province. I think that sort of encouraging the Syrians to abandon their country, encouraging the Syrian Kurds to abandon their country is really premature and doesn't really recognize the fluidity of what's going on the ground there. There actually is the potential for the first time in 8 years to break through to a peace agreement. Peace agreements have been unable to be achieved in the past because people have refused to acknowledge that Assad is staying. It's easy to say Assad is all of the things that he likely is, but it's harder to acknowledge that no matter who he is staying, and that peace on the ground will ultimately, for the Syrian Kurds, probably come through an arrangement with Assad's regime. There has been a huge diplomatic breakthrough. So as much as we have all the talk of Sturm und Drang and, the world is ending and there's going to be a Kurdish genocide, perhaps the opposite's going to happen. I don't think we yet know, and no one can predict the future with certainty, but it actually looks as if there has been a somewhat reasonable withdrawal. You have the Syrian Kurdish generals now saying that they have agreed with the withdrawal. There is now in place, hopefully, a long-term ceasefire. So while nothing is ever perfect in Syria, nothing is ever perfect in the Middle East, I think rather than say it's the end of the world, we should say this is a big transition, this is a big realignment of interest there, and there's a possibility that the Kurds could get a homeland. The last thing you would want is to say to all the leaders in the Kurdish community, all the intellectuals, those who speak English, those who are open to Western ways, hey, come over here and abandon your country. It would be equivalent to France saying to George Washington during or after the war, hey guys, hey founding fathers, why don't y'all come to France? It's not a good notion to ask the leaders of a country and a movement to leave and abandon their country. So with that, I respectfully object.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard. The senator for Virginia.
Mr. President, I disagree with my friend from Kentucky about what may or may not happen. I believe that one thing I would agree with him on, that we've not often had well-organized plans in the Middle East. The unique thing about our alliance was the Kurds was, after trying in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places around the region to find allies who would actually stand up and fight, in the Kurds, we found those allies. And they did a remarkable job dismantling ISIS. Now, Senator from Kentucky's prognostication, I don't agree with, but time will tell. The one area, though, and what my legislation would have done, and where I'm disappointed we were not able to move forward on, is regardless of the changed circumstances that an Assad regime may have in terms of treating people with more respect, or the Turkish militias, which we've already seen evidence of their killing of Kurdish fighters. The one group I think that is probably safe to say will be the targets of both the Syrians, the Turks, the militias, will be those individuals, those Kurdish individuals who work directly for the U.S. military. Even if if the senator from Kentucky's prognostication plays out on a more macro basis, I don't think anyone with a straight face can say the Turkish or the Kurdish translators who 2 weeks ago were working for the American forces, that they won't be victims of whether it be Turkish, Syrian, Russian, or other aggression. I think it would have been the right thing, and I'm going to continue to try to find ways to bring this legislation to the floor. I know it would be broadly bipartisan supported. I hope we'll have a chance to revisit this. I don't think we can ever fully reverse the actions this president has taken, but at least in terms of these translators. This is not talking about taking the whole Kurdish leadership, but these generally men who 2 weeks ago were working for the American military. I think we owe them a greater debt of obligation than to simply say, good luck.
Mr. President.
The senator for Kentucky.
I think one of the interesting things about the Kurdish situation and about Syria in general is how quickly the Kurds and Assad actually did ally. If you've watched the war over the last 8 years, the Kurds and Assad have largely not fought each other. There isn't a great deal of the blood sort of lust or curdling animosity between the two, and it was actually pretty remarkable how quickly they came together. One of the things is we think we're doing best, and we try to do the best when we insert ourselves in the Middle East, but sometimes we get unintended consequences. So we've been there, and we want peace, but we refuse to allow the Kurds to talk to Assad. There's a stalemated civil war that's gone on 8 years. Had we never been involved, Assad likely would have crushed the rebellion in 6 months. Maybe 500,000 people wouldn't have died. Maybe 3 million people wouldn't have left. And you'd still have a dictator. Instead, we have 500,000 people dead, 3 million refugees, and we still have a dictator. And so I think we need to question our strategy as to what our intended goal is and what ends up happening. Syria is an utter disaster, but made no better by our intervention, the Saudis' intervention, and Qataris' intervention. There's a great deal of unknown as to whether or not the Sunni extremists that were supported by the Saudis and the Qataris, and sometimes us, would actually be more humanitarian or more for human rights than Assad is. I think we can agree that Assad has abused his people, has used chemical weapons, et cetera, et cetera. But the other side were Sunni extremists allied with the ideas of radical Islam, with radical jihad, with the things that led to 9/11. So it's a very complicated situation over there, but I think that we cannot say with certainty that there will not be a deal that sticks, actually, between Assad and the Kurds. If the Kurds want a homeland and they believe Assad is staying, it makes all the sense in the world for them to work together. If Assad wants to actually protect that region of North Syria, either from Turkey or from others, and the Kurds are willing to help him do it, the Kurds have proven that they are good fighters. The Kurds would probably have to acknowledge that there is a greater Syria and that they're part of it. If they want to break off from Syria, there'll be continual war. If they're able to make an arrangement with Assad, there's a chance that there could be an oil-sharing arrangement like we have in Iraq. The bottom line is we sometimes see the world in black and white terms and think that, we can get Thomas Jefferson in Syria or in Libya or in Iraq. But what happens is time and time again, we topple a dictator, we get chaos, we get more terrorism. ISIS sprang out of the vacuum that was Iraq after a government that was incapable of doing it after we get rid of the same. Same thing happened when we got rid of Gaddafi in Libya. I think we need to rethink our approach to the Middle East.
Mr. President, I won't.
The senator for Virginia.
I won't belabor the point. I know my friend from Connecticut is here to raise another issue. I don't agree with the president's the senator from Kentucky's analysis. Now that things have happened, I hope he proves to be right. I would agree with him that sometimes our notion that we're going to find Thomas Jefferson to rebuild these countries has not proven to be the case. This legislation I'm proposing is not broad policy changing. It is simply saying, let's look at a very limited universe of individuals who 2 weeks ago were working with the American military. And my fear, Mr. President, is that at least in terms of how those translators and their families will be viewed by both the Turks and by the Assad forces. They will not be viewed as Thomas Jefferson's, but they will be viewed as Benedict Arnold's, and my fear is their fate will be on our hands. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The senator for Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank my colleague from Virginia for his advocacy on this critical measure, and I support him on it, and also for his advocacy on the FIRE Act, very similar to the measure on which I am going to ask for unanimous consent. He's done wonderful and dedicated work on both measures, and I want to make